Hello and good afternoon. Thank you all for joining. I am Kirsten Axelsen. I'm a visiting scholar with the American Enterprise Institute, and I am joined today here with three leading minds in legal scholarship, and we're going to be discussing intellectual property policy for medicines and vaccines. This is a topic you're probably hearing a lot about lately. It is being hotly debated in Congress by thought leaders in policy. I'm going to take us through a few slides just to set up our conversation, and then I'm really going to turn it over to these three who I am honored to be able to share the stage with today. First of all, I'm going to give us a basic overview of intellectual property for medicines and vaccines, how it influences the decisions that are made, how it influences investment in scientific advances, both in the academic setting and in private industry. A few of the reasons why certain policymakers are interested in relaxing intellectual property protection for medicines and biopharmaceuticals in the US. And then I'll turn it over to our discussion with today's panelists. So, very quick basics. Patent term for drugs is 20 years, but drugs do not have effective time on the market that is 20 years because it takes a good amount of time to develop a drug. A patent is not the same as data exclusivity. Data exclusivity is the exclusive right of the drug developer to use their clinical trial data. Clinical trial and the investment in clinical trials is, depending on which estimate you use, between $1 billion and $2 billion. It's a lot of money, it's a lot of time. Data exclusivity gives the gives the company that invested in that clinical trial the ability to exclusively market the drug. Does not preclude competitors from who are in the same therapeutic class from launching a drug. Patent and data exclusivity typically run concurrently, and I'm going to show you a schematic in a moment that kind of describes the typical life cycle of a successful drug. And then there's special incentives that encourage the development of drugs that might not otherwise get developed. For example, for small populations, for rare diseases where there wouldn't necessarily be a viable commercial model, where there are not special incentives to either approve the drug faster or give the drug a little bit more time on the market. What is hotly debated about intellectual property for medicines right now? There's one side of the coin that says intellectual property protections encourage the development of important life-changing science, and again, in particular, in areas where there's a high unmet need with these special incentives or for chronic conditions. And then there's the other side of the coin where you say, well, patents sustain a monopoly and they encourage wasteful R&D just for the purpose of making money. And so we're going to talk a little bit about where those arguments hold water on either side. So this is sort of a typical drug life cycle illustration. I actually shouldn't say typical because most drugs fail. So most of the drugs, there's a preclinical phase, and there's this very careful decision that's made about when to seek a patent, because once the patent is sought, of course, then the clock starts running. And you want to be able to develop that drug as quickly as possible and have the longest amount of time that drug is on the market without a generic or a biosimilar entrant. Then the investment really starts there to increase. First in human trials, trials become larger, sometimes with hundreds and thousands of people. Depending on the trial, it can be a global trial. The investment ramps up, so that's all spending, it's all spending, it's all spending. And then at FDA approval, you start to see revenue from the drug. But the spending does not stop when the drug is approved. You get post-market study in things like children, in other indications, in the types of people who aren't typically included in the pre-market clinical studies, people with comorbidities or certain conditions. With cancer, you often see the drug studied in earlier stages of cancer, whereas in the pre-pivotal trial stage, it's often in the later stage metastatic disease. And then even after the drug goes off patent, there continues to be investment made in safety monitoring, which happens throughout the entire life cycle of the drug, even when the vast majority of the drugs that are being used are generic. These are some of the common critiques of intellectual property for medicines that we're going to discuss as a panel, that patent thickets keep out generic competition, that low-income countries can't afford medicines because of patents, that clinical development is done not for health or for science, but it's just done to sustain a monopoly, that the government pays for the research on drugs, so why shouldn't the government be able to decide who holds the IP? There's a number of proposals that would weaken intellectual property on medicines in the U.S., and we're going to discuss those today. They include march-in rights or limits on the ability to seek damages from the government using intellectual property that was developed by a private industry. A very simple example, or a quick example, I'm going to give a simplistic explanation, is BDo patents, which allow a private entity to retain control of their intellectual property even when the government has funded some part of their research. It accounts for a relatively small proportion of patents awarded in any year, and universities are the most common holders of BDo patents. I'm just going to go ahead. And so finally, to wrap up, I work in the biopharma industry for 19 years. I'm still a consultant to the biopharma industry, so I want to make sure that is clear when you sort of know where my experience lies and also some of the affiliations I have. But one of the jobs I did have in the biopharma industry was to do modeling around the decision to invest or not invest in a clinical development program. And this schematic kind of shows you the order of consideration when a company is deciding what to invest in. First, most primarily is the technology likely to work to modify the disease safely and efficaciously? Second is, what's the time on the market that will be when that drug will able to be sold? And that is, of course, very connected to the intellectual property. And then there's the size of the potential market, and there's reimbursement. But there's a lot more that you can do around market size and reimbursement. If there's not good science and if there's not a good patent, that drug will not be developed. The investment in this clinical development will not be made. So now I'm going to turn it to our panelists. These are some of the questions I'm going to ask. I'm actually just going to go ahead and put this back up. So first, can I ask, starting with Judge Michel, to please introduce yourself and your connection to this topic, and I'll ask everybody down the line to do that.
I served for 22 years on America's Patent Court, the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, until I retired in 2010, and I've been making a nuisance of myself since then by participating in the public policy debate relating to patents. And I think it's a critical topic, particularly right now for our country, our economy, even our national security.
Thank you. Judge Braden?
I was the chief judge of the trial court that Judge Michel presided over. And we have exclusive jurisdiction over a statute, which you'll hear a little bit about later, which is 28 U.S.C. 1498A. And I became interested in this area when I found out that there was some academic research going on that was actually getting into the public domain, talking about using that statute to basically disenfranchise someone's patent. And so I wrote a law review article about it, and it turned out to be that I was maybe a year ahead of the curve. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And since then, I have been fortunate to be the jurist in residence for the Center for Intellectual Property and Policy at the Antonin Scalia Law School, where our next speaker is an esteemed professor.
A professor.
And esteemed professor.
Adam Mossoff, professor at the Antonin Scalia Law School at George Mason University, and I have done extensive amount of research and publications, not the academic research that Judge Braden just mentioned, but other research that on the historical and economic and theoretical role that patents serve as property rights, as drivers of not just innovation, but drivers of economic growth and the innovation economy in the United States for the past 200 years.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to go ahead and put my first question to Judge Michel. Can you give us a bit of history on BDo, its intent, and what it has meant for investment in clinical development for medicines and vaccines?
Well, the BDo Act was passed in 1980, and it completely revolutionized the economics and the science of human health. In the decades before 1980, most of the inventions at research universities or government labs that benefited from some or extensive government investment sat on the shelves. Only 4% of 28,000 government-owned patents were ever commercialized, ever got to consumers. So the main point of the BDo Act was to change that. And they did it by making the university that got the government grant able to license, to own the patent, and then to license it exclusively to a company that would develop it and had the wherewithal to do that. It was a huge success in the 43 years since then. In the decades before 1980, our biopharma industries were flagging and falling behind competitors, particularly in Europe. In the decades since the BDo Act was passed, we've dominated the whole world in biopharma inventions. Everybody knows about the famous COVID-19 vaccine, for example, and there are endless other examples. It's hard to overstate the importance of this sea change. The Economist magazine said the BDo Act was the most inspired piece of legislation in America in over half a century. And that's no exaggeration. It totally changed. And it let people do what they do best. The research universities and government labs and other nonprofit labs, they're fabulous researchers, but they're not good commercializers because that's not what their profession is. That's not what their experience is. On the private sector side, the companies, large and small, including many startups, are very good at commercializing. So the BDo Act empowered both groups to do what they do best and to do it in a coordinated way. And it has worked absolute wonders. I think it's kind of astonishing that anybody is talking about or considering throttling the BDo Act when it has been so helpful to patients and the whole population. It has created trillions of dollars of economic growth. It has spawned many thousands of new companies doing great work. It's employed millions of people, mostly at very high salaries. So by any economic or scientific or human health measure, it's been a total success. So why would we want to trash it now?
Thank you. So Judge Braden, to kind of follow on that question, where did the concept of reducing IP protection come from then? And why is there interest in expanding March-in rights or otherwise limiting the ability to protect the patent?
When you were little, did you play a game called telephone? So you said something and the next, it passed down through, and then finally at the end,
Yeah.
it was, what the answer was different than really was what the beginner had a new life. This is what got me interested in this. In 2018, the New York Times published an editorial. The caption read, "How the Government Can Lower Drug Prices," and it announced a possible solution involves an obscure part of a federal law known as Section 1498. That was my old job. The provision acts as sort of an eminent domain for patented inventions, allowing the government to circumvent patent protections if the patent holder is compensated. In the case of a pharmaceutical, the Department of HHS can authorize a drug maker to produce a low-cost generic version, which it then buy in bulk. The authority for this article was a Yale Journal of Law and Technology article by a professor and two of her students in 2016. A few months later, after President Biden's inauguration, Bernie Sanders and Senator Sanders delivered an opening statement to the new committee he was in charge of, Health, Education, Labor, and Pension Subcommittee, and he introduced Senate Bill 909 called the Prescription Drug Price Release Act, citing the New York Times article as authority, which cited this basically at that time obscure law review written by a bunch of students. From that, Elizabeth Warren began a pen pal relationship with the Secretary of HHS. And she and got several of her colleagues started writing letters, and over time they've eventually gotten 100 signatures of members of Congress, primarily a few senators, to the HHS Secretary to invoke 1498. And all this is based on what? A law review article, which my article, which was, I couldn't get anybody to publish it at that time because it was, no one knew what 1498A was. But thank God the Food and Drug Law Institute Law Journal, which I'm sure all of you keep by your bedside, published it. And then Adam wrote another law review article expanding on what we did. And what we did is basically tore apart the arguments in this Yale article. But that's how this started.
Wow. Thank you.
It's like telephone, right?
Thank you.
If the New York Times says it, it must be true. Right?
So, Adam, let's talk about this concept of bad actors. Is there a metric that you could say, well, that's an excessive number of patents? What is excessive patent protection? Are there places where the government should be stepping in to break a monopoly?
Yeah, that's a great question because one often hears in the policy debates and from organizations such as IMAC and others, oh, there's too many patents on drugs, or there's a patent thicket in this area. There is, as a preliminary matter, no metric for how many patents should exist on any particular product. The metric is there an innovation? And when you apply for a patent, they apply the patentability, the legal requirements. Is this new and novel and useful? And if it is, then you're awarded the patent. And there are numerous products and services with many, many patents on them because their various components of them feature different innovations, right? So a good example is your smartphone. This has tens of thousands of patents on it. Some estimate hundreds of thousands. In fact, they don't really fully know. The 5G technology that you use, or 4G or 3G, right, has hundreds, if not thousands, of patents as well. They do what's called portfolio licensing, where the companies just license their whole slew of patents because there's too many to license individually. There's estimates that golf balls have 20, 30, 40 patents on them. Thomas Edison got tens of patents on his light bulb. So it's the question isn't how many patents should there be. The question is there innovation being created? And if it is, it should be recognized and protected because the patents are the property rights that facilitate the licensing and commercial activity that make it possible for people like Thomas Edison or the inventor of the golf ball, or even, for instance, the inventor of sliced bread, Otto Rohrwetter, got 3 patents on his process and machines for creating sliced bread in the 1920s. You say 3 patents? Really? Yes, 3 patents. And that's what made it possible for him to facilitate incredible revolution in the production of this amazing product that we all now take for granted and think it's the greatest, has become the metric for greatest innovations, right? So broadly framed, the concern here is there's a lot of propaganda and rhetoric about patents and the number of patents. And in fact, economists universally recognize that actually patent counting, just counting the number of patents, is no more an indicator of innovation than it is an indicator of non-innovation or blockades in innovation. It's what do the patents represent? What's the innovation that is protected and secured by them? But I do want to emphasize, as a conclusion too, there's a lot of propaganda and misrepresentation of patents in the policy debates. So one often hears is patent thickets on drugs. There's too many patents on any particular drugs. And you should know that these numbers come from this organization that goes by the acronym IMAC, which is specifically founded to accuse patents as being monopolies that are preventing drug innovation. And they produce these splashy pamphlets that are distributed on the Hill, and their numbers have been cited by Congress, they've been cited by academics, and yet they have never revealed their database, their data underlying how they got these numbers. Senator Tillis wrote to the leader of IMAC and said, please disclose your underlying data and your methodology. And they wrote a 7-page answer to Senator Tillis, which can be summed up as no. I mean, and
Go away.
while at the same time attacking the biopharma industry in the same letter for their bad practices and opaque, non-transparent ways that they are blockading innovation. And just to give you a sense of this, IMAC, for instance, claims that there's 68 patents that cover Lyrica, really important drug that treats the pain from nerve damage. Our only public source that we have of how many patents actually cover Lyrica is what's called the Orange Book. It's an official book at the FDA where biopharma innovators are required to list patents. And they list 4 patents. 4, where IMAC claims 68, and IMAC won't even tell us how they got that 68 number. So you need to be really, really wary and suspicious. And whenever someone makes a claim about how many patents are covered on a particular product or service, you really should make sure to ask them, well, where did you get that from? And how do you know that? And what's the innovation that's actually represented there?
Thank you. My next question is for Judge Braden. Again, kind of continuing on with this, how do we monitor for egregious practices in patenting? How effective is patent screening by the U.S. Patent Office in limiting egregious practices in biopharma? And are there ways the FDA should be working better with the USPTO?
Well, I learned a lot about what's going on at the PTO by, I was appointed to the Private Patent Advisory Committee by the former director, Ayanku. And about a year ago, the administration asked the the Food and Drug Administration to engage in a collaborative effort with the Patent Office to see if they could do a better job at facilitating better patents coming in the pharma area and other things. What they've done is supposed to have been out in a public study, but it hasn't been publicized yet. But I can tell you that the staff at the Patent Office did not find any data to support the issue of patent thickets in pharmaceuticals. And that shouldn't come as a surprise, because about 10 years ago, the Federal Trade Commission had a study from a group of economists. And you can find this on the internet, although it takes a while because the Federal Trade Commission took it down from their individual website in this administration. But it said that there's no data that supports saying that there are patent thickets in pharma. There are patent thickets, but they're in the electronic area, or like your Apple Watch has a lot of patents in it. That if you want to say having a lot of patents on a particular working device is a thicket, then that's an example of it, but it's not in pharma. But it's like many things, these words, catchwords, thickets, evergreening, become easy ways of characterizing things without having people think or understand what is the basis for any of that. I will say that the Patent Office has made a great deal of improvement in terms of their ability to do prior art search. In the last 2 years, every single patent examiner now has a tool where they can search prior art anywhere in the world, and it simultaneously translates it into English. They never had this before. And in addition to that, there have been, I think, some really good efforts between the Patent Office and the Food and Drug Administration folks to come over and see what the Patent Office does, and vice versa, at the staff level. And I think that's very useful. I wish that that was going on at the Justice Department and the Federal Trade Commission, who are involved in cases and have no idea what goes into when a patent is looked at. Now, Judge Michel's colleagues have been very efficient at doing what the PTAB has been efficient at doing, which is basically declaring a lot of patents to be invalid. But I wonder if that may not turn around now. In a few years, we may see that change with these new tools that the patent examiners have, where they're going to have a much more extensive ability, at least on the prior art area, to really create perhaps a better quality patent that they couldn't in the way that they were trained to do things before. So I don't want to say that the collaboration is a bad idea. I don't think that's true. At the staff level, I think it's good that people learn what the agencies, each of them do, and particularly the FTC and the Justice Department needs to get over there and figure out what's going on, because they don't know. So we'll see what the final study comes out, or if it comes out at all. It may be that the fact that there's no problem is not welcome news. We'll see.
Judge Michel, can I ask you how the system of intellectual property protection for medicines in the U.S. compares to the protections granted in other countries, since we're talking about?
Well, as I said, generally speaking, the U.S. biopharma industry has exploded with creativity in the 43 years since the BDo Act was passed. Some of the research is done in-house by pharma companies, but much of it originates with upstream basic science research at our great research universities, and they then patent it, the university does, then they license it to somebody who can develop it and commercialize it, turn it into an actual product, and get it on shelves for the benefit of patients and consumers. So in general, we've been doing way better than other regions and countries since BDo, and to a great extent because of BDo. There are some problems, but they're not, with regard to the BDo regime, the problems have come from the courts that have created so much uncertainty about what sort of inventions are even eligible for patenting. And that's created a morass and very much discouraged the huge investments needed. As was mentioned, in modern medicine, new pharmaceuticals and bio inventions, therapeutics, cures, diagnostics, and the rest tend to be very expensive and require many years of hard work by brilliant people. So the investment to make that happen of money is really critical, and that depends on the incentives. And the BDo greatly ramped up the incentive by allowing for exclusive licenses. When licenses weren't exclusive, nobody took any. That's why all those government patents sat on the shelves. After BDo, it went in the opposite direction, and they were farmed out to private companies who developed it. So we have some problems compared to other countries having to do with eligibility or injunctions or other technical aspects of patent law. But in terms of the financing of further discovery and creation and marketing of cures, we're miles ahead of anybody, and a lot of that is because of BDo. So once again, I'm just flabbergasted that anybody wants to weaken it or end it, because it's been such a total success. And what could be more important than more cures, better diagnostics? Any doctor will tell you the key to medicine is early, accurate diagnosis. So diagnostic methods are the most important thing of all. Well, they're now ineligible in America because of ill-advised Supreme Court decision-making. So the Supreme Court and even the Federal Circuit have created a lot of problems. But they have nothing to do with BDo, and they can be fixed by legislation, and there are pending bills right now that would fix the eligibility mess, and other bills that address other problems. But the key thing to remember is how the patent system works. When people talk about patent thickets, the charge is that follow-on patents are covering the same drug that got the first patent, the actual molecule. That's not true. It can't be true because every patent has to be for a separate, different invention that passes all the tests of eligibility and novelty and non-obviousness and proper disclosure. So what do these follow-on patents cover? They cover new inventions that are related in a way, but they don't cover the original molecule, the actual drug. So when the 20 years are up, that drug is free for anybody to use, and it is used. The follow-on patents cover other things like specific formulations or new methods of administration. And again, they have to be real inventions. They can't just say something. They have to prove that it meets all these requirements. So the basic charge that protection is being extended by thickets is basically a falsehood. The protection over the drug is not being extended by 1 day. It can't be. All that gets protected is what the new patent covers, and it doesn't cover the original molecule. So it's an example of the propaganda and the misleading statements made by self-interested people. Look, we all know when a lot of money is involved, a lot of lies get told by people who are very focused on the money, on any side of the equation. And that's exactly what's happened in this public policy debate. It's been contaminated by enormous amounts of misinformation and catchwords, as Judge Braden is appropriately calling them, patent trolls, patent thickets, evergreening, you've heard them all. And they're all phony. They're propaganda words. They're not scientific words. They're not legal words. They don't have clear, understood, reasonable definitions. So you have to be on your guard. As soon as you hear one of these buzz phrases or buzzwords, you say, wait a minute, let's be sure I understand what you're really saying here. And what's your proof? Where's your evidence? What are the statistics? Where are the numbers? That's what we should be asking so we can have a debate that's rational and fair. Of course, drug prices are a problem for some Americans. Many drugs are extremely expensive. Of course, some people are protected by Medicare or Medicaid, other people by very strong insurance, but some people are not well protected, and something should be done about it. But trashing the patent system or killing by dole is not the way to take care of those people. The way to take care of those people is by expanding the protections like Medicare or Medicaid so that they can afford the drugs they need. So we're being told we should kill the golden goose because it will make patents more affordable, which number one, it won't. But even if it did, you don't need to kill the golden goose. Help the people who can't afford their drugs the way we always have in the past in this country. It requires legislation by Congress. That's what the so-called Obamacare was about and other similar legislation. So yes, there's a problem with affordability and there's a solution, and it's not to kill the patent system.
Thank you. So Judge Braden, for you, why do we want the government and private industry to work together? Doesn't the private industry have all the money they need? Why do they need the government's money or the government's investment in their research?
Well, first of all, government funding and research in this country has fallen precipitously in the last 8-9 years. The National Center for Science and Engineering Statistics recently came out with a report, and it indicated that R&D in the United States by private industry increased by $51 billion in 2020. So it went from $717 billion to $792 billion. Now, if the BDo Act provisions are changed by, we haven't talked about the fact that there are guidelines that are being proposed right now. But if the system is changed, here's what's at risk. Say you're a large company, and let's not even do it in pharma. Let's just say you're an automotive manufacturer. There are a lot of patented products in that area. And you work with Ohio State University, say, and you have licensed their patent on something that's important. Let's just say it's a new brake system or something. And you're off manufacturing and producing and sending stuff out, and a government agency someplace decides that they don't like the price that you're charging for those brakes. So they're going to come in and say, you can't use that patent anymore to make those brakes. Now, you've invested a lot of money in doing that. Now, what happens to that investment? Is somebody going to compensate you for that? And the answer people have is, well, you can go to Judge Braden's court and you can file a lawsuit. And that's 1498A. And you can make your argument that the government has caused you harm in taking your intellectual property case. And Judge Braden can give you damages. And guess who pays for those damages? You, the public. Now, what sense does that make? You're simply posing a tax on the American public for the privilege of fooling around with what in private enterprise. You have to have property rights are important to be settled in the law. You don't want to buy a house and find out later on that the government can decide, well, you had a private loan you had a loan from the government of some sort. They don't like the price, and they're going to come in and say that I know you have that house, but we'd like that back because we think you didn't. We could get a better deal from somebody else. It's important for property rights to be settled at every level. And what this act is doing is saying it's not just pharmaceutical, it's across the board. But the administration has issued guidelines that will be applied to every single industry in this country. Now, if that doesn't alarm you, it should. So all the people that are putting this money in are doing it because they're settled property rights. And they hope that someone will invest and buy the product that they make. And they don't know whether that's going to happen or not. They're taking a guess that they might. Their product could fail. People decide, well, I don't like those brakes. I would rather have a car with different brakes. Will people put money into these industries anymore? And the answer is no, not in this country. They will go any place in the world where they can make a profit. It doesn't have to be in the United States. And there are lots of other places in the world where, well, people are as educated and perhaps better educated than we are in this country. So this is not a minor matter.
Thank you.
Kirsten, we already know the answer to what will happen if patents are seized or patents are not allowed to be exclusively licensed, because that's what we had before BDo for many, many, many decades. It was a disaster. So we already know what you get if you go down that road. So why would we want to go down that road again?
That's an excellent point.
Excuse me, but
Yeah.
I don't know why we're worried about the Chinese. We're doing a perfectly good job of destroying the economy that we have all by ourselves. And in order to have a democracy, you have to have a vibrant economy. You have to have people fed, housed, and have a stake in the system and not fighting in the streets. So this is not a small thing. It's not just a law review issue. This is an issue about our democracy. I'm sorry.
No,
But
that's
I care very much about this. I think this is not a small thing.
Well, the rationale for taking away IP has often been affordability. So Adam, let me ask you, is intellectual property a barrier to access to medicine? And does that differ whether you're low income or high income?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's an example of how the framing of the debate automatically tilts it against patent owners, right? So it starts from the presumption, there's open access or patents that blockade access and blockade innovation. Now justify why you are hurting people and harming people. Mm-hmm. And so it shows you how even the underlying framing, right, tilts the debate against the patent system and against innovators. In fact, the reality is the exact opposite. patents are not a blockade or raise prices. Patents are a facilitator of access. They are a facilitator of economic activity. They are the source of the impetus for not just the invention, but the distribution through the marketplace, through licenses, contracts, business models, franchise deals, information sharing agreements, and all the other types of interactions that are formulated around property rights in every other context occurs around these property rights that we happen to call patents. And this is how you get this incredible distribution throughout the world of all of these products and services. There are more smartphones on the planet now than there are people. And this is a supercomputer that we carry in our pocket. And we now have treatments for conditions that have been killing untold numbers of humans for tens of thousands of years. Diabetes, hepatitis, cancer, and even new conditions like AIDS that were made possible by the modern pharmaceutical sector and the innovators who were able to invest billions of dollars. The economic estimates are it's anywhere between $2.5 to $3 billion of R&D, sunk costs, before a single pharmaceutical company sells their very first pill. And as Judge Braden and Judge Michel, I think, very eloquently explained, who would make that investment if they weren't able to then enter into the marketplace with secure and reliable property rights and creating not just the massive global supply chain in manufacturing and creating this, but the distribution chain. Now, we as humans always look for the simple explanation for things. And so it's always easy then to say, oh yes, so there's this patent, which is everyone knows and calls a monopoly, is the blockade here. And that's so improperly reductionist. It's so excessively simplistic. There are a lot of reasons why people don't have access, from regulatory barriers, which are regulatory barriers that we have chosen as a society, like FDA safety testing, which takes years. Example that I often use is that the COVID-19 vaccines created by Moderna and by BioNTech. BioNTech created its COVID vaccine in 3 hours, and Moderna created theirs in 2 weeks. That means by January of 2020, the FDA had in their hands the vaccines. Well, why weren't there shots in arms until December of 2020? Because the FDA was doing safety testing, was doing efficacy testing to ensure that the vaccines actually did what we wanted them to do. And there are other regulatory barriers. There's Obamacare, and there's an extensive amount of cross-subsidization and cross-shifting that occurs not just domestically, but internationally. We are the last country in the world where pharmaceutical companies and innovators can still set the prices for their own drugs in a competitive marketplace. Every other country, it's the government that turns around and tells the innovator, this is what you're going to be, we're going to pay you for this. This is what you're going to charge. And if you want to sell anything in our country, we're the government. This is what you're going to have to do. And no one talks about that. No one talks about trade barriers, regulatory barriers, cross-subsidization, and things of these things. All they talk about are patents. And yet, the patents are the very reason why we have all of these incredible new drugs and services. As Judge Michel said, the United States is, to this day, the greatest innovator in the biopharma space. The biotech revolution happened in the United States because we were the first country that said biotech was patentable. It was protectable. These were protectable innovations. And this is why, at this point, somewhere over between 50% to 66% of all new drugs invented in the entire world are created here in the United States. And we are about to, as Judge Michel and Judge Braden, I think, very eloquently and factually described, right? We are about to kill this golden goose of innovation by imposing price controls, by tearing out this promise of reliable and effective property rights that are foundational to not just the people making investments, but to creating the market structures and the business agreements necessary to put these new products and services, these miracles, in the hands of patients and consumers.
It's certainly right to be talking about the science and the practicality and the economics as we have been. But just for a second, turning to the law, patents are property. How do we know that? Well, because Congress has told us that in the Patent Act that goes back 200 and some years. In two places, it says that patents are property. So that question has been settled democratically in our country for all that time. Now, when somebody says march in, it's another one of these cute phrases. It sort of sounds like a parade or something, like something okay, you know. But what it really amounts to is that a piece of private property is going to be seized by the government from the owner of that private property, who made all the investments and did all the work and did all the science to create something new and good and useful. When the government does that, it's liable. The Constitution has a protection of private property. It's called the Takings Clause. It's in the Fifth Amendment. If you take somebody's private property as the government, you have to pay them. It's called just compensation. If the government marches in and takes patents away from pharma companies or biotech companies or any companies, the government is going to have to pay way more than anything that's going to get saved. So it's a ridiculous bargain. We're going to lose money if we do that. And besides, it's flat illegal. The government shouldn't be doing things that are against the law. The BDo Act does not provide for using the so-called march-in rights to reclaim a patent in order to control prices, full stop. There's not a single word in there. There's no legislative history suggesting that. The two senators who have the bill named after them have written articles saying that was never the intent. Prices were not ever part of the calculus or the genesis of this act. And yet the current administration is proposing, as I read the document, that they will march in on any product, including in pharmaceuticals, if they think the price is higher than it should be. It's not legal. If we're going to do that, Congress has to change the law. And they haven't changed the law. It's not been amended in all 43 years. And listen to this. Every administration over that 43 years, Republican, Democratic, liberal, conservative, whatever, has agreed there's no lawful authority to march in and take patents to control prices. Even the Biden administration agreed as recently as 10 months ago that price control could not be advanced by march-in. And now suddenly they're saying, oh, yes, it can. Well, where does that come from? There's nothing in the act. There's nothing in the history of the act. There's nothing in any of the history of these administrations of both parties that would support that. I mean, I have to suspect that this is somehow related to the current election campaign, and it's sort of a PR gesture to try to show that the administration is on the warpath against high prices that, of course, worry people, and we should solve the problem, but not by destroying the system that creates all this great medicine.
Thank you so much. Now I'd like to turn it over to questions from the audience. For those of you who are online, you email the questions and I will see them. I see one in the audience. Thank you. Yeah, Jack will come around with the microphone as well.
Yes, my name is Roger Cochetti, and I'm an editorial contributor to The Hill newspaper. I have no background in the subject and no expertise whatsoever, so that makes me a good test tube for sort of public reactions to this. And I have two questions. One is take an extreme example just to push the logic of it and say the government spends $100 billion developing a new drug, either through university or in, government, and then some smart pharmaceutical company picks it up and markets it, and this is a life-saving thing. Then we all had to pay $1,000 each in taxes to develop this, and because it's life-saving, the government then the marketing firm decides to charge $10,000 per dose for it. You either pay the $10,000 or you die. So you sell your house or sell your car, do whatever you have to if you want to live. So take that extreme, obviously ridiculous example and pick it apart so that we can understand the logic of a marketing company having exclusive control over something that the government had to pay? And the second quick question is, could somebody go down a little bit in greater detail, since much of the world has socialized medicine, where the government, National Health Service in Britain and France and all these countries, how do they deal with this? Because they claim to invent drugs all the time in these countries, and they claim that the United States is not the only source of new drugs. It just, gets a lot of publicity. So, but first, pick apart the hypothetical example so we can understand the logic of a marketing company having exclusive control over something that's 100% paid for, but is paid for by the public and life-saving for the user.
Yeah, but the trouble is that that's not the fact. The fact is that the government invests, for example, NIH will give a grant to some great university, and their medical school will do a whole lot of research, and then it'll be licensed by the university to a private company to develop it. And the private company will spend 100 times more than the government grant was. So the real numbers are the opposite of your hypothetical. If your hypothetical was the norm, it would be a whole different problem. But the reality is quite the opposite. And beside, the government can't market products, can't manufacture products. It doesn't do that. It doesn't know how to do that. It isn't good at that. It doesn't have expertise or experience at that. The private companies do. So this magic formula, the government comes up with a small amount of money, gives it to a university. The university does great research and discovers some new medicine. The university then licenses it to Pfizer or whoever, and they develop it further into a real product. They invest a huge amount of money, often billions, and they walk it through these very tough FDA tests, clinical trials as they're called. Most fail there, just the way most fail in the lab. But once in a while, one comes through, and that one has to pay for all the failures. That's the only way the system can work. Money doesn't, fall out of the sky. So we have a system that's worked well, and we should keep it. And we should provide relief for people who can't afford medicine through social means, the way we already do with Medicare and Medicaid and other such programs.
Yeah, the key is what we want is evidence-based policymaking, and the problem is that the arguments that are driving our policies right now are hypotheticals, scenarios that don't reflect the actual facts. So the data that underlying what Judge Michel just talked about, because most people do think, everyone says, oh, well, the government paid for these drugs, so why are we asked to pay for it again? That's actually not true, as Judge Michel just described. And here's just a little bit of the data. So in 2018, which is the last year that I have the data from, private companies, private funding of biopharma R&D was approximately $129 billion. Now, in comparison, the NIH, which is the primary source of R&D, public R&D funding, provided a grant at a level of $30 billion that year. So you had a 4 times more private funding of R&D into biopharmaceutical innovation than public. But even there, the NIH grants and how these started is that there is far upstream research, very theoretical, early stage research that private companies don't want to invest in because they don't know where it's going to go, right? And so that's what the government actually ends up funding, and the studies have actually shown this. So one study looked at the total number of grants given by the NIH in just 1 year, which was in 2001, was over 23,000 grants. And by 2020, those 23,000 grants have been linked to only 18 FDA-approved drugs. Because most of the funding goes to very far upstream research that doesn't actually develop into anything that is turned into a product that's used or sold. And that when that upstream funding actually does show promise, that's when the private companies step in. That's when they actually get the patent at the university. They license it to the company. The company then spends the billions, as Judge Michel just described, in going through the FDA testing process, setting up the manufacturing facilities, setting up the distribution facilities, and actually getting this into the hands of consumers and patients. And so it's primarily privately driven innovation, which is why the facts are that most innovation occurs in this country. I don't know why other countries are saying that they're innovative. The facts show that almost 2/3 of all new drugs are invented in the United States. I mean, to this day. And to the extent that the other third are occurring, it's because the private companies in those countries, in Switzerland and others, can get patents in the United States and can sell in the United States their drugs and can fund their R&D and continue to fund future R&D and their commercial investments.
The only thing I would add is the people that put money into the pharmaceutical companies, if they don't get the return they want, they can put it someplace else. They have no, I don't think there is a strong view in terms of what your money, what industry you're in. It's where do I get the return? Otherwise, they could, build casinos in Las Vegas or other places. I mean, this system has really been set up, I think, in a way that makes a great deal of sense. It's funny. The first inaugural address that George Washington ever gave talked about patents. And the reason it did is that after we won the war with the British, this country was bankrupt. It had no money. It couldn't pay off war debt to anybody. And they were trying to figure out how in the world, even with an agrarian economy, how do you create an economic system that'll sustain the democracy? And the idea was innovation. There's no incentive to innovate in England because whatever you had belonged to the crown. And that was really one of the things that was ingenious about the decision to create a patent office in the Constitution. And it worked. It worked. And aren't we lucky in this country to have grown up in a system where we're not hungry? And we have this morning's news. Cancer is down by 30% in this country. We ought to wake up and think about, thank God for the system that we have. We don't want to throw it away. We want to improve it, but we don't want to throw it away.
Thank you. I'll take one more question. Yes.
Dr. Myrtle Alexander, I have a simple question. So with this potential quote unquote patent snatch, who would it benefit the most?
Paul?
Can you clarify the question? I didn't quite get it.
So we have a potential patent snatch with taking patents away from industries. Who would be the most beneficial of this outcome if it were to pass and if it were to become a reality in the United States? Who would benefit the most?
Well, I think the taxpayers would lose in general. The investors would run away from supporting new innovation.
This would be gone.
The only beneficiary that you can even argue would be somebody who is struggling to afford a drug that they really need, because the price would drop if there's no patent. That's a fact. I mean, the purpose of patents is to create a legal basis to charge a premium in order to recover the investment made to create the drug in the first place and to finance the creation of the next drug and the next and the next and the next. And that's exactly how the system has worked. So cutting off that cycle seems like the opposite of what we want to do. We ought to want to make that cycle work even better and faster.
And the reason I ask the question is it seems like the government really doesn't have an idea as to why they're doing what they're doing, which is in reverse to the foundation of this country. And so it just makes, there's no real common sense to this act.
Well, I think
I'm
it's
getting it.
interesting that the Patent Office was apparently not consulted in this March-in proposal.
No,
And
they were
neither
excluded.
were the other knowledgeable parts of the government. It looks like this came right from the White House, and that's why I have to suspect that it's a campaign-oriented public relations gesture. But whatever the motivation is, it's plainly unsound. There's no study showing it will do any good. There's no economic study. There's no legal study showing it's even lawful, which I can tell you it's plainly not lawful. So this is crazy. What a way to proceed, to make public policy by fiat in order to get a headline when it's not legal and not economically beneficial and not going to help patients either.
You know, I don't want to ever see another ad for a pharmaceutical drug on TV with all these happy people running around saying, I need this for that or whatever, and ask your doctor. That is a total waste of money. The American public needs to understand what it costs to make a drug, what the risk is, and why the system is set up so that sometimes the drugs are high at the beginning, and the reason for that is there's a short time period that you can sell it. They don't have 20 years to sell the drug. They've got about 4. I may be wrong about that.
It's about 12.
You know the answer to this. It depends. But it's a small bit of the total amount, okay, where they have the opportunity to do that. One way of doing this might be to make pharmaceutical patents for a longer time period. That's one thing that might be helpful. I haven't looked at the data, probably Adam has. But I've thought of a great commercial. Everybody knows someone in their family, their neighborhood, or whatever, or you may be concerned about having Alzheimer's. Certainly I am concerned about having Alzheimer's. And the ad would go like this. You just see somebody pouring money down a drain, and it keeps pouring. And you say, this is the money that's gone in to try to develop a drug that will solve Alzheimer's. Should we stop? Do you want us to stop or keep pouring the money? And maybe we'll find something.
Excellent.
One more question.
I think
That's
we've
my
got-
ad.
I think this will be our very last question, and then we'll wrap up. I see. Yeah.
I enjoyed the presentation very much. Thank you. I'm Willie Chirpman. I'm a biosecurity fellow in Senator Todd Young's office. I guess I very briefly just wanted to give a bit of color to what Adam was saying, which is NIH may fund research on pathways relevant to a disease, but to go from that to a drug being approved, pharma companies are going to spend a lot of money figuring out, okay, which drug actually targets the pathway effectively, what's the formulation we're going to use, how toxic is it, do a bunch of in vitro animal studies before human trials, and those are going to cost many hundreds of millions or billions, and then you have to manufacture at scale and all this stuff. So yeah, it's just the first step in a long process. But I guess I'm curious, many of you have said, this is plainly illegal, but in practice, does that mean that some pharma company has to have this exercised on them and then take it to court? Or is there some legal remedy before that occurs that may occur?
Well, hopefully there's a common sense remedy and a political remedy to talk the administration out of pursuing this crazy sounding plan. If it does get implemented, of course there'll be lawsuits in enormous numbers involving hundreds of billions of dollars, liability for the taxpayers, which is not what we need. We already have a fiscal crisis in the United States and budget deficits and high interest rates for all of our past borrowing and so on. The last thing we need is to sock ourselves with further economic disaster. In some imaginary world, you could say, okay, we won't have any private industry. We'll have the government finance everything, all the research, all the production, all the development, all the commercialization, all the distribution, everything else. That's the opposite of the world we actually have now. And you can't create that world unless you have the money. And the United States government doesn't have the money. We're already out of money. We've been running on borrowed money in massive amounts year after year after year for decades now. So the idea that the government can do all the things that the private money is doing now is just complete fiction. It can't possibly do that. So whatever the theory might be, the reality is we are dependent on private money by venture